The rancher pretended to sleep to test the Apache sisters, froze when he heard their plan. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale, one filled with suspense and unexpected twists. In the rough wilderness of the American West, a lonely rancher named Samuel Hardin had built a life for himself far from the chaos of the world. Samuel was a man of few words, preferring the quiet company of his cattle and the stillness of the sprawling plains. His ranch sat at the edge of the territory, a small, modest place with a weathered barn, a rickety house, and the constant hum of wind through the dry grasses. But Samuel had no interest in the affairs of others. He was a man who had learned long ago that trusting people often led to disappointment. He'd lost his family in a fire years ago, and the scars from that tragedy ran deep, not just on his skin, but in his heart. The last thing he wanted was to get involved in the world's troubles again. Yet, life has a way of drawing you into its drama whether you like it or not. It was late one evening, the sun setting behind the jagged mountains in the distance, when two women appeared at Samuel's doorstep. They were Apache, their faces painted with the marks of their tribe. The older woman, tall and strong, stepped forward first, while the younger one, smaller and more hesitant, lingered behind. They looked at Samuel with a mixture of wariness and hope, their eyes sharp, yet filled with unspoken need. The older woman, whose name was Ayana, spoke first. "We seek shelter for the night," she said, her voice steady but carrying a hint of urgency. Samuel studied them both carefully, his gaze lingering on the younger woman, who looked like she had seen more than her share of hardship. But despite their plea, Samuel wasn't easily swayed. He had learned to be cautious, and instinct told him these women weren't just ordinary travelers. They had a purpose, one that went far beyond the simple need for a place to rest. So, Samuel did what he did best. He stayed silent and observed. He didn't offer them food or shelter right away. Instead, he motioned for them to sit on the porch while he went inside to grab a drink. As he passed by the open window, he quietly peered out. The two women were talking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the wind. But Samuel, ever the keen observer, wasn't one to miss details. He leaned in closer, straining to hear what they were saying. The words that reached his ears sent a chill down his spine. The older woman, Ayana, was speaking of a plan that would involve far more than just a quiet night's rest. They were talking about revenge against those who had wronged their people. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to piece together what he had just overheard. He wasn't sure why, but something in his gut told him that helping these women could lead to more trouble than he was willing to face. Yet, there was a part of him that felt compelled to act. What had they planned? What would their next move be? He couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice letting them into his home. Samuel didn't know it yet, but this decision was about to change the course of his life forever. The night was thick with tension as Samuel stood in the shadow of the window, his mind racing. The wind howled outside, but inside, a quiet unease settled over the room. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he had overheard. The women, Ayana and her younger companion, were plotting something far greater than just seeking shelter. As he slowly walked back to the porch, his boots creaking on the wooden floor, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake letting them stay. His instincts told him they weren't just ordinary travelers. They had a mission, one that would bring him into the heart of their world. Ayana looked up as Samuel returned, her expression unreadable. The younger woman, whose name Samuel hadn't yet learned, still stood quietly by her side, watching him with sharp, calculating eyes. It was as if they were both sizing him up, just as he had done to them earlier. Ayana spoke first, her voice low but firm. "We seek more than just rest tonight," she said, her gaze never leaving his face. Samuel met her eyes, trying to gauge whether she was going to ask for something he wasn't ready to give. "We need your help," Ayana continued, her tone calm, but with an underlying urgency. "There's a fight ahead, and we have no choice but to see it through." Samuel raised an eyebrow, his suspicion growing. He had known from the moment they had arrived that they were hiding something, but this was more than he had expected. "What kind of fight?" he asked, his voice steady, though his heart began to beat faster. Ayana hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It's a fight for survival," she said. "For my people, for my land. We are facing a group that seeks to destroy us. They will stop at nothing to take what is ours." Samuel remained silent for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't want to get involved. He had learned long ago that helping others only led to trouble, but there was something in Ayana's voice, something raw and desperate, that made him pause. "What do you need from me?" Samuel finally asked, though he knew he was already stepping into something bigger than he had anticipated. Ayana's eyes softened slightly. "We need a place to stay, somewhere safe, where we can regroup. We need your strength, your knowledge of this land. Together, we might stand a chance against them." The younger woman, still standing silently, finally spoke. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "They'll be here soon. We need to prepare." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He wasn't a fighter. He was a rancher, someone who knew how to care for animals and survive the harsh land. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about defending something worth fighting for. As he led them inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, its warm glow casting long shadows across the room. Samuel didn't know it yet, but his decision to help these women would change the course of his life forever. They weren't just asking for help, they were pulling him into their fight, a fight that would challenge everything he had ever known. "We'll stay the night," Samuel said, though he wasn't sure if he was making a mistake or not. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They were already in this together. The night passed slowly, with the three of them sitting in the dimly lit room, the weight of the coming battle hanging over them like a storm. Samuel couldn't sleep. His mind kept turning over the events of the night, the plans, the promises, and the unknown danger that awaited them all. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the walls, Samuel stood, feeling the heavy burden of responsibility press on him. The women were right. This fight was coming, and it was only a matter of time before they would all have to face it together. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the ranch. Samuel stood by the window, watching the world wake up in the quiet of the early morning. The silence was broken only by the distant calls of birds and the rustle of the wind through the tall grass. It was a peaceful morning, but Samuel's mind was far from calm. His thoughts were consumed with the events of the previous night and the mysterious women he had taken in. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a dangerous choice. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on his chest, but there was no turning back now. He had already promised them shelter, and that promise had bound him to their cause. Samuel turned away from the window, his gaze falling on the two women sitting quietly at the table. Ayana was deep in thought, her hands resting on the wooden surface, her eyes fixed on the floor. The younger woman, whose name Samuel had finally learned was Naya, stood by the door, her posture tense as if she were ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. They were both on edge, the calm before the storm hanging thick in the air. Samuel had learned that these women were not to be underestimated. They had a strength that went beyond their physical appearance, something deep within them that made them resilient in the face of adversity. He had heard enough of their story to know they were not just survivors, but warriors in their own right. And now, they were asking for his help. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming, but he knew he couldn't back out. The bond between them had already been formed, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. "What's the plan?" Samuel asked, breaking the silence. Ayana looked up, her dark eyes meeting his with a mixture of determination and caution. "We leave at dawn," she said quietly. "We have to move quickly. The enemy is close, and if we wait too long, they'll find us." Samuel nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. He had lived his life avoiding conflict, but now it seemed that conflict was coming to him, whether he was ready or not. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady. "But I need to know exactly what we're facing. Who are these people, and what do they want?" Ayana hesitated for a moment, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "They are part of a larger group. Mercenaries, hired guns, working for someone who wants to take over our land. They've been terrorizing our people for months, burning villages, stealing cattle, and leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. We're the last ones standing in their way." Samuel's stomach tightened as he absorbed her words. He had heard whispers of such groups in the region, but he had never imagined they would come this far. The thought of innocent people being slaughtered for the greed of others made his blood boil. "How many are there?" he asked, his jaw set. Ayana's expression darkened. "There's a small army, maybe 200 strong. But we can't face them head on. We need to be smart, move in the shadows, and strike when they least expect it." Samuel ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. 200 mercenaries was a formidable force, but Ayana was right. Head-on confrontation would be suicide. He wasn't a fighter, but he had lived through enough hardship to know how to survive. He had fought his own battles in the past, though they had been different. Now, he was about to fight a much larger battle, one that could cost him everything. Naya spoke up, her voice sharp and urgent. "We need your knowledge of this land," she said. "We've been tracking them, but we're unfamiliar with the terrain. You know where they're most likely to strike next, where the safest routes are." Samuel looked at her, then at Ayana. He had no choice but to help them. This was his fight now, too. "I'll take you to the old canyon," he said finally. "It's narrow, and there's a path that leads to the caves. If we can get there before they do, we might have the advantage." Ayana nodded, her face grim. "Thank you," she said softly, though her eyes showed that she didn't expect gratitude. She was a warrior, and to her, this was just another step in the struggle. As Samuel made preparations, his heart raced. The weight of the responsibility ahead of him was heavier than any load he had ever carried, but he knew it was the right thing to do. He wasn't just protecting these women anymore. He was protecting a chance for survival, for justice, for a future that didn't involve destruction. They gathered their things quickly, and by the time the sun had risen fully above the mountains, they were ready to move. The air was cool, the sky still pale with the early light, but the danger was already looming. Samuel led the way, the horses' hooves pounding the dirt as they set off into the wilderness. The road ahead would be long, and the dangers they faced were unknown, but Samuel knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back. The path through the canyon grew steeper as the group rode further into the mountains. Samuel had led Ayana and Naya along a winding trail he knew well, one that twisted through narrow passageways and high ridges. The terrain was rough, the sharp rocks scraping against the horses' hooves, but it was the only route that offered some chance of safety. Samuel's eyes kept scanning the horizon, watching for any signs of movement, any shadow that might betray the mercenaries following their trail. The sun was high now, casting long shadows on the canyon walls as they reached the first of the caves. Ayana was alert, her eyes darting from one corner to another as she dismounted. Naya followed close behind, her face tense, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. Samuel looked at them, unsure of what to say. The silence between them had grown thick. They had been traveling together for hours, but the weight of the mission ahead seemed to hang over them like a storm cloud. "This is the place," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. The cave entrance was small, nestled between two jagged rocks. It had been a hiding place for many over the years, a secret refuge when danger loomed close. He had come here before, in the past, to escape the troubles of the world. Now, it would serve as a base of operations for something much larger. Ayana nodded. "We'll need to rest here for the night. We'll move again at first light," she said, her voice clipped. She was already scanning the surroundings, looking for any sign of trouble. Naya remained silent, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. The shadows were stretching longer as the day gave way to night. Samuel didn't say anything as he tethered the horses and helped them settle. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air in the canyon felt thick, heavy with the promise of an imminent storm. "You're nervous," Ayana said after a long pause, her voice cutting through the silence. Samuel glanced at her, surprised that she had noticed. "I've seen men like you," she continued. "Quiet, always watching, always waiting for something bad to happen. It's part of who you are, isn't it?" Samuel didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. She was right, in a way. He had spent years living in isolation, keeping to himself, avoiding the chaos of the world. Now, it seemed that the chaos had found him again. But it wasn't just the danger that unsettled him. It was the feeling that he had stepped into something far bigger than he could control. "It's not the danger that bothers me," Samuel finally said, his voice low. "It's what happens when it's over. What happens when the dust settles." Who do you become after all this? Ayana was silent for a moment, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light. Then she spoke. You become who you were always meant to be, she said, her voice steady and sure. Not a hero, not a villain. Just someone who did what had to be done. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Samuel wasn't sure what to make of them. He wasn't a man of destiny, not someone who believed in grand causes or heroic battles. He was just a rancher, trying to survive. But as he looked at Ayana, he realized that she wasn't like other people he had met. She was a warrior, and she believed in something greater than herself. And somehow, that belief had drawn him in. The fire crackled in the small camp as they sat around it, the shadows flickering across their faces. Samuel could hear the distant howls of coyotes, the rustling of the wind through the trees. But for the first time since they had met, he felt a sense of calm. The world was still dangerous, but with Ayana and Naya by his side, he felt like he might stand a chance. As the night grew darker, they spoke little. The weight of the journey ahead hung heavily on them all. Samuel lay down under the open sky, his thoughts racing. What would tomorrow bring? He didn't know, but he knew that whatever happened, he couldn't turn back now. He had already crossed a line, and there was no going back. The next morning came too quickly, the sun rising over the canyon walls as they prepared to move out. They packed their things quietly, the urgency of the mission pressing on them all. Samuel could feel the tension in the air as they mounted their horses and began to move again. This time, there was no turning back. They were heading straight into the heart of danger, and they would face whatever came together. The day was quiet, but the air was heavy with anticipation. The horses' hooves clattered lightly against the rocky path as Samuel, Ayana, and Naya continued their journey deeper into the canyon. The sun had risen high above the mountain peaks, casting a golden glow across the landscape. But the peace of the morning was deceptive. Samuel's thoughts raced as they rode, his mind constantly circling back to the unknown danger ahead. The group had been moving for hours, and yet the tension in the air only seemed to grow with every passing mile. Samuel knew they were getting closer to the enemy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The canyon narrowed as they continued, the towering cliffs on either side seeming to close in around them. The silence was almost oppressive, and Samuel could feel the weight of the mountains pressing down on him. He glanced at Ayana and Naya, both of whom seemed completely unfazed by the narrowing path. They were used to this, used to the constant danger that came with living in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Samuel had spent his life avoiding such conflict, but now it had found him, and there was no running from it. He had made his choice. He had chosen to fight, but what would that fight look like? As they pressed on, they came to a bend in the canyon, where the path split into two directions. Ayana halted her horse and turned to Samuel. "This is where we part ways," she said, her voice calm but firm. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. "The enemy is coming from both directions," Ayana explained. "We'll need to split up. I'll take Naya and head east. You go west. We'll create a diversion, then meet at the old trading post. It's the only chance we have." Samuel looked between them, weighing the decision. He had grown attached to these women, more than he had ever expected, and the thought of parting ways with them now felt like a betrayal. But he knew Ayana was right. Splitting up was their best chance. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath. "We'll meet at the post." With that, Ayana nodded and turned her horse, leading Naya down the eastern path. Samuel watched them disappear into the distance, a sense of dread settling in his chest. Alone again, he turned his horse toward the western path and rode off, the sound of hooves echoing off the canyon walls. The next few hours passed in a blur. Samuel's mind was sharp, his senses heightened as he rode. Every rustle in the brush, every distant sound, made him tense. He could feel the enemy's presence closing in, though he hadn't yet seen a single one of them. The canyon was eerily quiet now. There was no wind, no birdsong. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. As he rounded another bend, he spotted them. For riders, their silhouettes barely visible against the rocky landscape. They were moving slowly, scanning the path ahead as they approached. Samuel didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He urged his horse into a gallop, charging toward the riders with a speed he didn't know he had. The sound of hooves grew louder, and the riders turned just in time to see him coming. Samuel raised his rifle, taking aim as he galloped forward. His pulse raced as the first shot rang out. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the sharp crack of a second shot. The riders scattered, but Samuel was already moving, charging forward with reckless abandon. He knew he had to keep them off balance, keep them guessing. He fired again, striking one of the riders in the leg. The man cried out in pain, but stayed on his horse, though he was now slowed down. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed on. The remaining 3 riders turned and began to retreat, but Samuel wasn't done yet. He rode after them, his rifle raised, ready to strike again. But as he pushed forward, he realized something. He had no idea how many more were coming. He could hear the sounds of more horses in the distance, the pounding of hooves growing louder. There were more of them, and they were closing in fast. Samuel knew he couldn't take them all on alone. He had to get to the post. He had to make it to Ayana and Naya before it was too late. With one last glance at the retreating riders, Samuel turned his horse and spurred it into a full gallop, racing toward the old trading post. The wind whipped past his face as he rode, the dust from the canyon floor swirling in his wake. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but there was no time for that. The enemy was close, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Samuel's thoughts raced as the miles passed beneath him. He had to get there. He had to make it to Ayana and Naya before the enemy did. The fate of his life, and theirs, depended on it. Samuel rode hard, pushing his horse to its limits. The canyon was vast and the path treacherous, but he had no choice now. The sound of hooves behind him grew louder, and the enemy was closing in faster than he had anticipated. He could hear their shouts echoing in the distance, but he couldn't look back. He had to get to the trading post, to the safety of the rendezvous point. His mind raced with every step. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes searched the horizon for any sign of Ayana and Naya. Were they already there? Had they been caught? The thought of them being ambushed, of their lives hanging in the balance, gnawed at him. He couldn't let them down. The wind bit at his skin as the ground beneath him blurred, the thud of hooves and the rush of air all that he could hear. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, finally, he saw it. The old trading post loomed in the distance, just as he had remembered it. The small wooden structure, its roof sagging from age, sat at the edge of the canyon, surrounded by the broken remnants of what had once been a bustling stop on the trail. He urged his horse on, the animal responding with a burst of energy as they raced toward the post. The dust from the canyon floor kicked up in a cloud behind them, obscuring the path. Samuel's grip tightened on the reins. He was so close now. Just a little further. He rode past the crumbling walls of the post, but as he approached the main building, something caught his eye. There, standing in the doorway, was Ayana. She was watching him, her posture tense, but there was a look of relief in her eyes. "You made it," she said, her voice calm but edged with the exhaustion of the journey. Samuel dismounted quickly, his legs unsteady from the long ride. "I thought I'd lost you too," he said, his voice strained. "Where's Naya?" Ayana's eyes darkened. "She's inside. We have more company than we expected." Samuel frowned. "How many?" Ayana looked toward the horizon, her gaze sharp and calculating. "At least a dozen riders. They've been trailing us for hours. They're waiting for us to slip up." Samuel's pulse quickened. "We don't have much time, then. How much ammunition do we have?" Ayana hesitated, then nodded toward a small crate by the door. "Enough for a fight, but not much else. We'll have to hold them off, and hope help arrives before they overwhelm us." Samuel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't how he had imagined it. He had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but there was no avoiding the confrontation now. He had crossed too far into this fight to turn back. He walked to the crate and pulled out a rifle, checking it quickly before loading it with a few rounds. "We'll hold them off," he said, his voice low and steady. "We'll make sure they don't get to you." To Naya. Ayana watched him, her expression unreadable, before she nodded. "I knew I could count on you," she said quietly. But there was no time for thanks. The sound of galloping hooves reached their ears, growing louder by the second. Samuel looked out from behind the wooden walls of the trading post, and there they were, the riders. 12 strong, armed to the teeth, and ready for a fight. Samuel's heart raced as he took his position behind the post, his rifle aimed and ready. The riders were closing in fast, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Samuel wasn't about to give up without a fight. As the first rider came into view, Samuel fired, his aim true. The rider jerked back in his saddle, but didn't fall. The rest of the riders scattered, taking cover behind the rocks and debris. Ayana moved with the precision of a trained warrior, her bow drawn and ready. She fired quickly, taking out one of the men in the distance with a shot to the chest. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire as Samuel and Ayana fought side by side, each shot fired with purpose. The riders were relentless, but so were they. Samuel's mind raced as he aimed, fired, and reloaded. They couldn't afford to miss. They couldn't afford to fail. Just when Samuel thought they might have a chance, a shout rang out from behind him. He turned just in time to see another rider break through the smoke and dust, heading straight for Ayana. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as the rider reached for his weapon. Without thinking, he grabbed his rifle and fired once more, hitting the rider square in the chest. The man fell, his horse rearing back as he tumbled to the ground. Samuel's breath came in short gasps as he looked around. The riders were retreating now, but the battle was far from over. He had to make sure they didn't come back. He had to keep Ayana and Naya safe. As the dust settled, Samuel turned to Ayana, his eyes searching hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice heavy with relief. She nodded, her face grim. "We're not out of danger yet," she said. "But we've bought ourselves some time. Let's move. We'll head for the hills, find a safe place to regroup." Samuel didn't argue. He knew she was right. This was just the beginning. The battle had only just begun. The dust had barely settled when Samuel, Ayana, and Naya mounted their horses again, the weight of their recent victory hanging in the air. The sound of distant hooves echoed from the canyon behind them, a stark reminder that their fight was far from over. Samuel's heart raced as he scanned the horizon, the uneasy silence surrounding them like a thick blanket. They couldn't afford to rest for long. The riders they had fought off were only a small part of a much larger force. The mercenaries were relentless, and they would return, more prepared and more determined than before. "We need to keep moving," Ayana said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. She had a way of commanding attention with just her presence, her gaze sharp and calculating. Samuel could see the weight of their situation in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt the true gravity of what they were up against. Naya nodded silently, her expression unreadable, but Samuel could see the same determination in her that he had seen in Ayana. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. They had already proven that much. But as they rode deeper into the hills, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The terrain grew steeper, the path winding through rocky outcroppings and dense brush. Samuel had lived in these mountains long enough to know that they could hide secrets in the shadows, and that's exactly what he feared. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. As they reached a small clearing, Ayana signaled for them to stop. "We'll make camp here for the night," she said, dismounting quickly and pulling her gear from the saddle. Samuel followed suit, his mind still racing. He knew they couldn't rest easy. There was no such thing as safety now. The mercenaries would be closing in, and every moment counted. As the fire crackled to life, Samuel set up a perimeter, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest for any signs of movement. Ayana and Naya worked in silence, each focused on their tasks, their actions sharp and efficient. They had the same quiet intensity, the kind of focus that could only come from years of living on the edge. As night fell, the air grew colder, the shadows stretching long across the camp. Samuel sat by the fire, staring into the flames as the crackle of wood echoed in the stillness. "Do you think they'll find us?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if speaking the question aloud might make it real. Ayana didn't answer immediately. She sat across from him, her eyes distant, as if weighing the options in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "They will come," she said, her voice steady. "But we will be ready. We've already proven that we can fight. Now, we need to use the land to our advantage." Samuel nodded, understanding what she meant. The land was their ally, just as it had always been for him. The high ridges, the hidden paths, the caves, they could all be used to outmaneuver the mercenaries, but they would have to be smart about it. "How many more are there?" Samuel asked, unable to shake the worry gnawing at his gut. Ayana's gaze hardened. "They're part of a much larger group," she said. 200, maybe more. They've been hired by a man who wants to take everything we have. But they're not prepared for the land. They don't know it like we do. Samuel looked out into the darkening wilderness, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. 200 riders. He hadn't realized how badly they were outnumbered. But Ayana was right. The land was their greatest weapon. He had spent his life learning its secrets, its hidden paths, the places where even the most determined pursuers could be outwitted. He would use that knowledge now. As the fire flickered and the night deepened, Samuel felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something greater. This was about protecting the people who had come to trust him, even when he had no reason to trust them. It was about making sure the cycle of violence didn't claim more lives. They had a chance, and Samuel would be damned if he let it slip away. "We'll be ready," Samuel said, standing up and pulling his rifle from the saddle. "I know this land like the back of my hand. We'll fight from the shadows, and we'll make them regret ever crossing us." Ayana gave him a small nod, her lips curling into a faint smile. "I knew you were the right man for this," she said. But there was no time for celebration. The sound of hooves, faint but unmistakable, reached their ears. The mercenaries were coming. And this time, they wouldn't be so easy to escape. The game had changed, and now it was time for them to make their stand. The night was colder now, the first whispers of dawn barely visible over the mountain ridges. Samuel, Ayana, and Naya were crouched low behind a cluster of rocks, watching the mercenaries slowly approach their position. Their horses kicked up dust as they moved in tight formation, their faces grim and determined. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he took in the sight. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The air around them felt thick with tension, the weight of the fight hanging heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't a soldier, but the survival instinct that had kept him alive on this land for so many years was now sharpening into something more dangerous. "They're close," Naya whispered, her voice low but steady. Samuel nodded, his eyes never leaving the enemy. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm in a crisis, but now, as the sound of the riders grew louder, his nerves were beginning to fray. He had to trust in the plan. They would have to move quickly. The mercenaries had no idea the trap they were walking into. "Remember, we use the land to our advantage," Ayana said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't fight them head-on. We strike fast and retreat. Let them think they have the upper hand." Samuel glanced at her, seeing the same fire in her eyes that had kept her going all these years. Ayana had a quiet strength about her, and it was something that Samuel had come to rely on. "We do this together," Samuel said, gripping his rifle tightly. "No one gets left behind." Ayana gave a small nod, and Naya shifted her weight, preparing herself. The mercenaries were only a few hundred yards away now. Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle. His eyes scanned the terrain, looking for the best spots to use as cover. The canyon was narrow here, with large boulders scattered along the sides. It was the perfect place for an ambush, but only if they timed it right. "Get ready," Ayana murmured, and Samuel nodded. He could hear the wind in the canyon, but everything else was eerily quiet. The mercenaries were close now, too close. They were so focused on the path ahead that they didn't see the danger lurking in the shadows. The moment had come. Samuel stepped out from behind the rocks, rifle raised, his voice cold and commanding. Now, the silence shattered as gunfire erupted, the sound echoing through the canyon. Samuel fired first, his shot hitting one of the mercenaries in the chest. The man fell from his horse with a cry, and chaos erupted. The mercenaries scrambled, their horses bucking as they tried to return fire, but Samuel, Ayana, and Naya were already moving. They darted from cover to cover, quick and silent, making their way through the canyon with the precision of hunters. Every shot counted. Every movement had to be calculated. Ayana and Naya were fluid in their movements, their training evident as they moved with purpose, never hesitating, never second-guessing. Samuel followed their lead, doing his best to keep up, but it was clear they were far more experienced in combat than he was. The mercenaries, disoriented by the sudden attack, tried to regroup, but they were on unfamiliar ground. Samuel's heart raced as he took another shot, hitting a second rider in the arm. The man cried out in pain, but stayed on his horse. The mercenaries were retreating, but Samuel knew they wouldn't give up so easily. They were too well trained. But they were in the canyon now, and they didn't know the land the way he did. As the last of the mercenaries fell back, Samuel motioned for Ayana and Naya to stop. They were out of sight now, hidden behind a ridge, but they had to be cautious. "We've made our stand," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "But they'll be back." Ayana nodded, her face tense. "We need to move fast. They won't be the only ones coming." Samuel knew she was right. This had only been a small victory, but it had bought them precious time. Time to regroup, to make their next move. The wind began to pick up again, the sound of it filling the air as they quickly mounted their horses. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. As they made their way deeper into the canyon, Samuel couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. They had fought back, they had survived, but the real fight was still ahead. The battle for their land, for their people, had only just begun. And Samuel wasn't about to back down now. He would do whatever it took to protect those who had come to rely on him. The sound of their hooves echoed through the canyon as they moved, the quiet hum of the land around them acting as a reminder of the stakes at hand. Samuel looked at Ayana and Naya, both of them focused ahead, ready for whatever came next. He knew they had a long road ahead of them, but together, they just might stand a chance. The morning sun rose slowly over the hills, casting a soft golden light over the canyon. Samuel, Ayana, and Naya had made it through the night, but they knew the battle was far from over. The mercenaries had regrouped, and it was only a matter of time before they came for them again. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of their decision settling in. Samuel stood at the edge of the canyon, staring out at the land before him. The wind was calm, but there was an unease in the air, a tension that had settled deep within him. He had come to this place to be alone, to forget the pain of the past. But now, he was part of something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something worth protecting, his new family. "We have to move," Ayana said, her voice low but firm, breaking the silence. Samuel turned to face her, seeing the determination in her eyes. She had been through so much, and yet, she still fought. "They'll be here soon," Ayana continued. "We need to find a place to make our stand." Samuel nodded, understanding the urgency. The mercenaries were closing in, and they couldn't afford to waste time. The only question was where they could find safety in this rugged terrain. Naya, who had been quietly preparing their horses, looked up. "The old mine," she said. "It's not far from here, and it's hidden. We can take them by surprise." Ayana turned to Samuel, waiting for his approval. Samuel didn't hesitate. "Let's go," he said, mounting his horse. They rode in silence, their horses' hooves echoing in the canyon. The narrow path twisted through jagged rocks and dense trees, making it difficult for any large group of riders to follow. It was the perfect place to make their stand. As they reached the mine, Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The dark, narrow entrance was hidden from view, nestled between two towering cliffs. It was a place he had known about for years, a place he had come to in his loneliest moments. Now, it would serve as their battleground. They dismounted, moving quickly to secure their position. Samuel had no illusions. The fight would be hard, and it might cost them everything. But they had no choice. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sounds of hooves reached their ears. The mercenaries were coming. Samuel's heart raced as he took his position behind a large boulder, rifle in hand. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. The mercenaries emerged from the shadows, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the area. They were prepared for a fight, but they had underestimated the land and the people who knew it. Samuel waited for the right moment, his breath steady, his mind clear. As the first rider came into view, Samuel squeezed the trigger. The sound of the rifle echoed through the canyon, and the rider fell from his horse. The rest of the mercenaries scattered, returning fire as they tried to find cover. Samuel and Ayana moved quickly, using the rocks and trees as shields. Naya, too, was a force to be reckoned with, her quick reflexes and deadly aim making her an invaluable ally. The fight was fierce, but Samuel felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. Each shot he fired wasn't just an act of defense. It was an act of defiance against everything that had tried to tear him down. They fought for what was right, for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Hours passed, But the mercenaries were slowly being pushed back. They were disorganized, frustrated, and now, more desperate than ever. Samuel could see the fear in their eyes as they realized they were being outmatched in a place they didn't know. Finally, the last of the riders retreated, their numbers decimated. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest, his body trembling from the adrenaline of the fight. He looked around at Ayana and Naya, both of them breathing heavily but unharmed. They had won, but at what cost? As the dust settled, Samuel walked to the edge of the mine, looking out over the land. The sun had set, and the canyon was bathed in a deep, purple light. It was over for now, but Samuel knew the fight was far from finished. There would be more battles to come, more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long while, Samuel didn't feel alone. He had found his place in this fight, and he knew that, no matter what came next, he would never face it by himself. Ayana and Naya were with him now, and together, they had something worth protecting. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a man who had found a cause that would carry him through the toughest of times. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Samuel felt a flicker of hope rise within him. They had survived, and they would continue to fight for what mattered. Together, they were stronger than anything that could come against them.